A New York Times article is re-examining two deaths at a prison in Malone and questioning if Robert Brooks may not have been the first inmate in New York's prison system to die in the hands of corrections officers. 7 News reporter Lexi Bruning has more.
The December 2024 beating death of Robert Brooks made national headlines. The incident itself was caught on camera, and a handful of corrections officers, including Adams resident David Kingsley, sit in prison for their part in the murder. Brooks's death led the state to strengthen prison oversight, but a recent New York Times article reports similar cases from before December 2024 went unnoticed. According to the New York Times, upstate correctional facility inmate LaDale Kennedy was found unresponsive in his cell in 2022, hours after officers allegedly struck, pepper sprayed, and put a spit hood over him. The article states he was pleading with the officers and a nurse, saying he couldn't breathe. A portion of this is on video. In the case of Greenhaven Correctional Facility inmate Clement Lowe, the article reports he told his daughters the officers at the prison, north of New York City, quote, stomped on him and lashed his head with batons. After the alleged beating, the New York Times reports he was transferred to upstate where he died of a brain bleed in November 2023. According to the article, he wasn't given medical care while there despite his worsening condition.
We're concerned that that this is, unfortunately part of the culture that has evolved over time in the prisons. And one of the things that I think in the past legislative session and budget session, the legislature and the governor have taken some steps to begin addressing.
Recent legislation signed by the governor increases usage of body cameras and requires autopsy reports of inmates to include copies of photographs and x-rays, among other things. Local lawmakers say the new law vilifies COs. Prison worker unions say it will worsen the ongoing staffing crisis. The Department of Corrections and Community Supervision tells 7 News all deaths are investigated thoroughly by several organizations and reviewed by the State Commission of Correction. A spokesperson says Kennedy's death was listed as undetermined and Lowe died of natural causes. Jose Saldana, a former inmate and advocate for aging prisoners, says there's no accountability, telling the New York Times, quote, if Robert Brooks's brutal murder wasn't inadvertently captured on camera, they would have gotten away with it. Lexi Bruning, 7 News.